For Methodists, our DNA, our heritage, our inheritance, is about being organised in small groups. The first thing that John Wesley did when people were converted by his preaching, that he soon organised them into societies that met together midweek to share their faith.
The tradition of meeting in small groups may have been important to John Wesley's revival movement, but the idea isn't peculiar to Methodists. In fact, it goes right back to the roots of Christianity. The very early church was made up of small groups dotted around the Mediterranean and across the Roman Empire. Groups like the Christian community in Thessalonica, a port city situated in modern-day Greece.
We're here in my son's first home after university, a small home in a big city, a place of refuge, a place to come home to after work, a place to entertain friends, a place to call home. It's safe and it's secure. When we meet as small groups of Christians, we often think we're in a safe place. The early Christians in Thessalonica were small groups set in a big city, but they often met in small places, homes and workshops in that big society. For those early Christians in Thessalonica, meeting in those small spaces, it wasn't quite so secure. It didn't feel quite so safe. There's a story in the Acts of the Apostles about a man called Jason who entertained one of those groups. They came to his home, but he was taken away by the city authorities and questioned. What were they doing? What was all this about? Why were they locked away? Did they have secrets to keep? When we meet, I wonder if we begin to have that same sense of insecurity, that same sense of difference from those around us. We gather to have meaningful conversations, to learn from one another, to learn about faith. We keep it within those secure walls.
I feel passionately what we do in the church is of significance and interest to a much wider group of people than who actually come to church. And we don't package it, we don't present it in a way that's accessible and is non-threatening.
How and why do we form small groups? How did you or will you form yours? We asked 3 small group leaders to share the different ways in which they developed small groups, each with a different setting and motivation. David's motivation was mission, to reach beyond his own church congregation.
So I just produced a series of 7 discussions, starters. I've got an example here. It's just a one-pager thing. And it gives enough information and questions to get a group going without a lot of leadership.
My experience started when we first came to Inverness, and I joined the one house group that was happening, and it was very well established. It had been meeting for a number of years, but was quite a controlled situation. They were in the process of working through the York courses, and were quite rigid in following the material. And I found that after 2 or 3 weeks, the same people were talking, and the same views were coming out, just in a different guise.
So I contacted all those on my pastoral list who lived in the area, but also those who'd sort of dropped off by having transferred their membership to other churches, who we were still in contact with as friends, and invited them to take part in something which was originally not specifically designed to be a fellowship group, but a community of Christians in East Lothian who had Methodist roots, who wanted to care for each other and learn together how to be Christians in their current situation.
The first thing I introduced, or suggested, was using a 4-week course by Jeff Lucas, where you have a DVD to start the discussion off, and then some questions and discussion around the theme. But with a much shorter format, we're looking at an hour and a half instead of maybe 2 hours or 2.5 hours. And they really enjoyed that. So we did another Jeff Lucas. And then I told them that in a previous church, I'd done a Lent course called Chocolat, based on the film Chocolat. And we'd really enjoyed it. And so that whetted their appetite. And could we do Chocolat for Lent? So that sort of began a whole series of conversations as to whether we could expand this and include other people and get some fresh blood into this small group.
Thessalonica is a place that received the gospel because people came through, told the stories that they'd heard, and people were intrigued by those stories that they picked up, and a community began to form. Ideas were shared, new hopes were developed, and people learned from one another.
In the event, had enough people for 2 sessions. So one takes place on a Wednesday morning and the other one Wednesday evening in church. So the first one is in the morning one is in my house, and we have a shared lunch afterwards, bring and share. And doubled the number of people meeting in our small groups over Lent.
So we set it up in a hotel, a room in a hotel, booked that for 7 weeks, advertised it in the local paper. Word of mouth spread to a few other people to come along. And we had, well, first night, we had no idea who was coming. We had 15 people. So we split into 3 groups of 5. I gave them all the starters, discussion sections, explained how the thing would work, and then left people to it. And 2 hours later, we stopped the talk. You know, they really threw themselves into it. It was great to see.
But as they're getting to know each other, then things are being discussed and old things are coming to the surface, which is what it's all about.
That's what it was like for those people in Thessalonica. They were learning new things. They discovered new truths. They were following a new master. They stood out. What was it like for them? How could they find strength from one another as they met in their small groups? And how could they learn more and feel more secure in who they were?
There are things to think about when establishing a small group, apart from what to talk or pray about. What problems can we encounter in small group discussions? What ground rules might you lay down to avoid them? How important is the venue you use?
And did leaders naturally emerge in the discussion groups?
No, it wasn't really seeking to have leaders. That each group was. The one problem you get with that, I can think of one person in particular who liked the sound of their own voice and really needed somebody at that table just to, well, you've had your say, now let's move on to someone else. Occasionally the discussions were a little bit too dominated by one person without having a sort of facilitator at the table. Themes later.
What was it that made you decide you were going to use a hotel, a neutral territory, rather than your house? Did you feel that was something, because you were advertising in the local paper, did you feel you needed a neutral venue?
Yeah, well, our house wouldn't work because we're not really local, you see, so that was one issue. But I think actually a neutral venue was my idea, that it would enable people to come who wouldn't come to a church, perhaps, and who might think it was a bit of a insular, a bit of a clique if they were coming to a church member's house. Quite a few of them commented that they felt much more able to be open than they would have done, even in a church, house group, certainly in a church meeting.
Well, at most we're 8, so often we're not. Often we're sort of 3 or 4, which isn't really enough. It's good, but I'd like to see it developing a bit more. I think it needs a few more people to give it critical mass. If you know there are only going to be 3 of you and 2 of you are a couple, you begin to wonder whether it's worth going.
When we meet as our small groups, it can be very tempting to feel that we're so small and marginalised that there's very little point in what we're doing. But surely the story of the early Christians in places like Thessalonica says that's exactly where the power was. Those small groups who learned to live and love together and to express the love of God as they lived out lives in the ordinary world. Perhaps we should begin to think of the power that we can have in our small groups, of what we can learn together, the strength that that brings. Jesus told a story about it, of the mustard seed that grew into the biggest of all trees. Let's not be afraid of being small, but use it to our advantage. Of course, St. Paul wasn't able to stay with the groups. He would come and he would encourage them and help them to develop. But then he had to leave to go to other places, or in the case of Thessalonica, he was forced out. The groups then had to find ways to sustain their own life, develop their own leadership, and work out what it meant to be Christ's people in that place at that time.
So these small groups, to me, are the best part of our Methodist heritage. They serve as an entry point for us to come into relationship with each other and into relationship with God.
To me, that's the only way that people grow in their faith, is by being able to ask questions and to hear each other's points of view and to celebrate difference.
Almost any worship experience, it doesn't matter the style necessarily, I don't think. That's not the place where people will come more often than not into relationship with Christ. Because it's what we're doing in worship is we're worshiping God, and if you don't already have a relationship with God, it's going to be quite strange what you're doing.
Welcome to Segedunum, otherwise known as Wall's End, the eastern end of Hadrian's Wall on the eastern side of the city of Newcastle upon Tyne. Like Thessalonica, Newcastle is a port city, a place of comings and goings, travel, commerce, the mix of ideas.
With its Latin signs and sense of history, Wallsend offers us tantalising hints of life in a Roman Empire that the Thessalonian Christians would have known so well. A minority group, vulnerable to criticism, they had to develop their unique sense of community and build relationships of trust. In his letters to them, St. Paul offered guidance that still stands for any small Christian fellowship group.
When the small groups in places like Thessalonica met, they did so amidst everyday life. People were going about their ordinary business. It was busy, it was noisy. But they thought they were living in apocalyptic times, that the end was coming, that the fulfillment of creation was about to happen. Jesus would return. So why should they worry about what was going on around them? They could do pretty much what they want. They knew what their answer was going to be. But Paul's very clear with the people. You must live well. You must live lives that other people will see something special in.
For this is the will of God, that no one wrongs or exploits a brother or sister. For God did not call us to impurity, but in holiness. We urge you to aspire to live quietly, to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we directed you, so that you may behave properly towards outsiders and be dependent on no one. Be at peace among yourselves, admonish the idlers, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with all of them. See that none of you repays evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to all. As members of small groups, we should ask ourselves, are we only here to talk and pray? How should we relate to one another? What examples should we be setting as a group to others in our church and community?
It's a bit like Jesus' story about the yeast, about being something that grows within the community and helps other people to understand the message. I think Paul was saying to his people, you must become very attractive communities. Communities that people want to join because they see something special in the way you are with one another.
Audrey, Alison and David have all had experience of forming small groups in different contexts. They know that the process of sharing together can raise difficulties. Audrey discovered that one helpful technique was to build a discussion round a film or other DVD.
I just think from previous experience that if you can meet in small groups. You just get to know people in a different way. And it builds up the fellowship of the church in a way that people have been saying since we arrived was needed.
But isn't that one of the difficulties of the small group, is that you need to build up a certain amount of confidence in the people that you're with to be able to be open and sharing. But the more you do that, the more it becomes difficult to welcome new people in, because you've become a very self-supporting confessional group, which is actually a confessional clique.
Yes.
And then it's very hard to be as welcoming to people who haven't heard all that previous history.
Yes. So I think from that point of view, the fact that we've watched a film together and then we're watching clips from the film, it sort of helps that process because people are more relaxed. Whereas if you're doing a straight Bible study, people would come expecting that they've got to behave in a certain way maybe. But it'll be interesting.
It's very interesting that people they think there's an expectation of what they should say.
Yes.
Often in a Bible study setting.
Yes, it's Jesus.
Yeah. And or they also don't have confidence that what they really think is valid. Whereas in response to a film, it's probably quite different than we're able to say. And then
Often we talk about our churches as being attractional, by which we mean places that we can invite people into. I think the church in Thessalonica was a place that people would have wanted to join, because they saw the people there sharing in such a way that they were learning from one another, getting to understand each other's journeys, developing insights and understandings, and just sharing together in such an intimate, caring way that they had a very special quality that others would see in them. I wonder when we meet whether we can achieve that same sense of being so open with one another that we're sharing in the way that Christians through the centuries in a whole host of ways have done. And in doing that, other people wanting to be part of who we are, wanting to share their stories with us, and wanting to hear our stories.
But sometimes I think one of our problems is we're not at all good at listening for the signs, or reading the signs, or listening for the person who wants to talk to you.
Yes.
And providing an environment where that can happen is the missional environment.
It isn't sufficient simply to meet together as groups to support one another. That's a basic need for all of us. We all want the comfort, support and encouragement of those around us. But if it stops there, we are ceasing to carry out the work of the kingdom. And the work of the kingdom means first we have to meet as a group to pray, and secondly we have to meet as a group in order to love beyond our own immediate borders. So, as I said, love is an active verb. It means beginning to think about the mission of the church, what each individual group can do for the mission of the church.
Small groups are not designed to be closed circles. Like the communities of the early church, they are intended to be places of refreshment and strengthening for the journey, a journey that takes us out beyond our comfort zone in mission and action.
Here we are on Hadrian's Wall, that symbol of the mighty Roman Empire, built to separate the empire from all that lay beyond, a barrier on both sides. How often when we meet in our small groups and in our churches, do we put up false barriers? Do we enjoy being in our small rooms or our church congregations and don't really look beyond? We never try to break down the barrier.
One of the concerns where we are is the gradual decline. And now we're a big enough church for it not to matter in one sense at the moment, but it won't be many years before it does matter. And yet there's no motivation for mission. And so how do you get people able to talk to each other about their faith in order for them to be able to talk to somebody else for whom faith has not much meaning at the moment?
Those early Christians in Thessalonica, they had a sense that they needed to spread the gospel. And they no doubt did that in word. They gossiped the message so that people heard it beyond. But they also did more. Their very presence was a challenge to the authorities around them. They had this story of Jesus a king. Was he someone who'd come to challenge the authority in the city? If he was, that was a hard message for the people to take.
They dragged Jason and some believers before the city authorities, shouting, "These people who have been turning the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has entertained them as guests. They are all acting contrary to the decrees of the emperor, saying that there is another king named Jesus." The people and the city officials were disturbed when they heard this. In what ways do we act against the expectations of society? Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored?"
I wonder, as we meet in our groups, have we got the courage to challenge the things that we see around us? The injustices, the difficult situations, the people suffering around us, and say we have something to say in that situation. In fact, there's things that we can do.
I think one thing that's been interesting is when you get a group of people together who don't know each other very well, you find out that almost all of them, certainly within church circles, are involved voluntarily somewhere in the community, but we just don't know about it. Mm-hmm. You know, somebody will invigilate at exams or attend another lunch club or whatever, or support the hospice, serve teas at the hospital for the Red Cross, all sorts of things. But we tend not to talk about those things. So people are involved in Christian action, but independently and individually. So it's good to be able to share those things and get to know each other in that sense.
It's part of our Methodist heritage, isn't it, that we take part in social action, but we tend to do that in a divorced way from these small groups. Yes. Whereas Ken Weatherford, who's an American music missioner who's with us in the circuit at the minute, he was describing a small group experience he had in America where on the fourth, if they met weekly, then the fourth of those gatherings would be going out there and doing something activity rather than sitting around and talking about it. And I thought that was a really creative idea. It's all really verbal, so those people who are most articulate, and those people who are able to reflect very quickly, those people who can listen to the conversation and then only say one thing in the evening, but put it all into context. It's relaxing for them, but for some people, actually, that environment's quite threatening, and their skills may be completely different. It may be that they're better practically.
I'm just thinking of, I mentioned those student groups I used to belong to where we did every term we had a weekend or a day where we go and do some practical project. Often it was go and paint a house, someone older person in the church who maybe didn't have a family around, needed things done but couldn't do themselves. And a lot of our churches have people like that. A small group could provide that kind of support, and then that would be a way of involving the older person in the meeting.
I think one thing that's really good is just sharing ideas one group to another. I mean, just today I now want to know all about the things that you've been leading in discussion, but there's no reason why, if groups weren't connected in some way, they couldn't also share ideas about activities. Yes. And actually wouldn't necessarily be something that had happened in a small group. No.
How can we begin to break down the barriers? How can we stop ourselves from hiding within the walls and becoming a real part of the world, a challenge, a force for change amongst those around us?
And you became imitators of us and of the Lord. For in spite of persecution, you received the word with joy, inspired by the Holy Spirit, so that you became an example to all the believers in Macedonia and in Achaia.
This is a place that symbolises the opportunities that lie before us in life. The opportunities to communicate with one another, to share with one another and learn from different cultures. How will you take these lessons from the early church and seek the opportunities that God lays before you? Opportunities to share, to learn from one another, opportunities to spread the gospel, opportunities to put the gospel into action.